Welcome, everybody. The webinar will begin at the top of the hour, and it is being recorded. As we gather, we encourage you to connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page, Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. You'll see both of those on the slide here. Please use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything that you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Once again, Campaign wants to connect with you. So on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account Reading by Third. The webinar will begin shortly. It will be recorded and shared with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Science Matters webinar, part of our GLR Learning Tuesdays series. I'm Yoli Flores, Chief Learning Officer for the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. I'd like to start with just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself. So please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure to select panelists and attendees so that everyone can see you're here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box. For those of you that have been with us before, we used to ask questions in the chat box. We're now using Zoom webinars, so we've changed that a little bit. So use the Q&A for questions throughout the presentation as you hear the panelists. We'll spend the last 30 minutes responding to the questions that you post during the discussion. For those of you viewing the webinar in Teams, which we encourage for this Science Matters series, we'd love for you to take the time after the presentation to discuss top themes that you heard and perhaps identify at least one new idea that you would like to bring to your GLR coalition. And then during Q&A, let us know that you're with the team and about any question that you might have for any of the panelists. This webinar, as all, is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed next week to all of those who registered. And then finally, we will be posting a brief "What did you think?" poll during the Q&A, and we highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And now just a very brief background on GLR Learning Tuesdays. The campaign is building on its commitment to bring to the GLR network a more predictable and a more reliable set of learning opportunities, meaning that you can rely on high-value learning webinars every Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern. We've now hosted 19, maybe more webinars with a growing archive of recordings and resources available on Clip, which is our online platform. Our webinars serve as a portal to access and explore the best science, ideas, and programs for our work to ensure early school success for more children from low-income families. An important part of GLR Learning Tuesdays is our Science Matters webinar series, co-sponsored by the Bezos Family Foundation, with Bezos Chief Science Officer Ellen Galinsky serving as the host of this series, and you'll get to meet Ellen in just a moment. So let's get started. First, let me just say that having been a dual language learner myself, I'm excited about today's conversation focused on the science of dual language learning. According to Child Trends in 2016, 1 in 3 US children live in a household where a language other than English is spoken. Dual language learners, or DLLs, have the potential to excel in an increasingly diverse society. However, their academic achievement lags far behind those children whose only home language is English. While we know this, we also know that learning 2 languages or more has significant advantages in brain development, in improving cognitive skills, and overall school success throughout. But what exactly is the science around learning two languages, and how can we dispel myths and support young DLLs so that we prevent and close those gaps for a third of our children in the early years and the early grades? We'll explore these questions today with our rockstar panel that I will now introduce. And I'll introduce them in order in which they will be speaking. So first, as I mentioned earlier, is Ellen Galinsky, our host of Science Matters and our moderator. Ellen is the Chief Science Officer at the Bezos Family Foundation, where she also serves as the Executive Director of Mind in the Making. She remains President of Families and Work Institute, and her life's work revolves around identifying important societal questions as they emerge, conducting research to seek answers, and turning the findings into action. She strives to be ahead of the curve, to address compelling issues, and to provide rigorous data that can affect our lives. Ellen has conducted research on childcare, on parent-professional relationships, on parental growth and development, on early learning, and on work and family life, including directing or co-directing the largest ongoing nationally representative studies of employers and employees. Her career highlights include writing more than 100 books and reports, including her latest best-selling Mind in the Making, and over 300 articles, serving as a child expert on TV, being elected president of the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and so much more. Her bio, as with all the bios, will be available on Clip. So thank you, Ellen. Let me just quickly introduce our panelists, and then I'll turn it over to you. Dr. Sarah Lytle is the Director of Outreach and Education at the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences at the University of Washington. Sarah's team communicates the latest science of child development to those who can act on it. In recent years, the team has reached hundreds of thousands of parents, educators, policymakers, and opinion leaders, both locally and nationally. Under Sarah's leadership, the outreach and education team launched an online library of free training modules designed to make science accessible to a broad audience. Dr. Lytle has a BA in psychology and Spanish from the University of Notre Dame and a PhD in developmental psychology at Temple University, where she studied the role of social cues in infants and toddlers' language learning from screen media. Sarah is a member of the 0 to 3 Academy of Fellows. Next, we'll have Dr. Patricia Kuhl. Dr. Kuhl holds the Bezos Family Foundation Endowed Chair in Early Childhood Learning, is co-director of the University of Washington Institute for the Learning and Brain Sciences, and professor of speech and hearing sciences at the University of Washington in Seattle. She is internationally recognized for her research on early language learning and bilingual brain development, for pioneering brain measures on young children, and for studies that show how children learn. She presented her work at 2 White House conferences, Clinton White House in '97 and the Bush White House in 2001. In 2014, Dr. Kuhl was awarded an honorary doctorate from Stockholm University, and in 2015, the George A. Milner Prize in Cognitive Neuroscience. And finally is Dr. Linda Espinosa. Dr. Espinosa is Professor Emeritus of Early Childhood Education at the University of Missouri-Columbia, and has served as the co-director of the National Institute for Early Education Research, or NEAR, at Rutgers University, and is vice president at Bright Horizons Family Solutions. Dr. Espinosa also served on the Head Start National Reporting System Technical Advisory Group, as well as the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Head Start Research and Evaluation. Dr. Espinosa also was a member of the National Academy of Sciences, National Research Board, Committee on Early Childhood Pedagogy project, and a contributing author to Eager to Learn, Educating Our Preschoolers, published by the National Academies of Science. Dr. Espinosa's recent research and policy work has focused on effective curriculum and assessment practices for young children from low-income families who are dual language learners. She has published more than 90 research articles, book chapters, and training manuals on how to establish effective educational services for low-income minority families and children who are acquiring English as a second language. So Alan, before I turn it over to you, let me just say that we had tried to schedule this webinar several weeks and months ago, and everybody's schedules were quite challenging, and we just did not want to move forward with all of these presenters. They are the best in the country in helping us learn about brain development for dual language learners. And so I'm very honored and pleased that we waited for you, and we're eager to hear from each of you. So Ellen, I'll hand it over to you now.
And we're getting these very busy people in all parts of the world. Pat is traveling and speaking. Linda is in the mountains of Colorado. Sarah, I think, is actually in Seattle, but just imagine the joy for me of being able to assemble this group and to share their knowledge with you. So we can move ahead to Sarah, and to set the context for our discussion, we thought it would be important to look at, have a brief overview of how babies learn languages. So Sarah?
Wonderful. Thank you, Ellen, and thank you so much for the campaign for grade level reading, for hosting this wonderful webinar and providing an opportunity to talk about this great topic. So we thought it would be helpful to start first by thinking about how children learn language as a very basic question, partially because we know that how children learn their first language is very, very similar to how they learn their second, third, fourth, and so on languages. So we thought we would start with this sort of basic primer on, what first language learning looks like. And to begin with, I thought we'd play a little bit of a game here. And this is the same or different game. And for folks who are viewing in teams, this is a perfect opportunity for you to have a little bit of interaction with your teammates who are around you. And if you're participating by yourself, you can kind of think about the answer. But what I'd like to do is play 3 different pairs of sounds for you. And after each pair of sounds, what I'd like you to do is tell me if the sounds are the same or if they're different. So let's listen to sound number 1.
Ra.
And sound number 2.
La.
Same or different? Okay, hold that in mind. Let's move to sound 3.
Da.
Sound 4.
Da.
Same or different? All right, and then the last pair.
Da. Da.
Same or different? Okay, so the big reveal here. And as you might imagine, this was a little bit of a trick in the sense that all 3 pairs of sounds are in fact different, but there are sounds that are unique to each of these 3 languages. So if you grew up in a primarily English-speaking household or region, you are likely to have said that those first 2 sounds, the ra and the la, were different sounds. And in fact, they are. In the English language, we need to determine that rake is a different word from lake. They're very different in meaning and size and all kinds of aspects. So that ra and la are 2 different sounds. Similarly, those sounds in Spanish and the sounds that exist in Hindi are also very different sounds. But the idea is that unless you are a native speaker of these respective languages, I actually don't expect you to hear a difference from them or a difference between those 2 sounds. I'm not a native Spanish speaker. I'm not a native Hindi speaker. Sometimes I can, think that I can trick myself into thinking that I hear the difference, but, perhaps I do and perhaps I don't. But the idea is that when babies are born, babies, in fact, can hear all of the differences and all of the sounds of all the languages of the world. And that's an amazing concept. It's as if babies are prepared to be born into whatever language speaking environment they land in. So for babies who land in a Spanish speaking household, their brain is prepared to hear those differences in the Spanish language and the Spanish phonemes. And that's, with experience over time, that's exactly what they're going to develop, is the ability to really, really tell the difference between those Spanish sounds. But babies are these universalists that come into the world prepared to learn whatever language or languages we throw at them. And that's an important thing, because those early experiences then are very important. We know that those early experiences, in fact, begin before birth. So even though children can tell the difference between all those sounds of all the languages of the world, even hours after children are born, minutes after children are born, we know that they already can start to tell us that the language that mom spoke, or the language that their birth parents spoke, is already sort of preferential in their brain. If you see this young baby here, he's using a sucking paradigm. So we know that children tend to suck faster and harder when they hear something that's novel to them. And so this baby, by the rate of sucking and the strength of his sucking response, can tell us when he hears sounds that are novel to him. And so we can play him sounds from the language that he heard in the womb as mom was speaking, that language, from the 3rd trimester on. That auditory signal gets passed to baby via bone structure and liquid structure through mom. And the baby is already starting to develop the ability to determine which language and which sounds are native to mom's language and which sounds are different than what they have experience with. And so even as we're thinking about the role of experience in shaping language, we know that begins before birth. And it continues on. Experiences shape language from before birth, and it continues in those first few years of life. So if you're seeing a tree, if you're seeing the blossoms on a tree, and as perhaps dad is describing that to you, we know that early on that's really helping children build that set of sounds that they are likely to hear in their environment. Later on, it's going to help them build their vocabulary, learn the grammatical structure of that language, but that experience is really what's going to help children. If we think about another way that we try to measure experiences and how experiences shape development, we can watch a video here that shows us another paradigm. We talked about the sucking paradigm. This one shows a head turn paradigm in action. It's one way we test children's ability to learn and differentiate between the sounds of language. Let's go ahead and play it.
Can a baby as young as 6 months old hear the difference between 2 vowels? This baby is trained to look for the toy when the sound changes. She's being distracted, so she'll turn only when she hears the difference in sounds. The key question, will she turn before the toy lights up?
So that baby very clearly knew the difference between the sounds ah and e, and you can see that head turn response. I will say a very fun part of being a developmental psychologist is coming up with a lot of these games that secretly test exactly what you're looking for, but also allow the kids to have fun. So this is our head turn in action.
Sarah, a couple of people have written in and asked if you share the differences between the sounds in English and Spanish and Hindu, whether you would share that, and so you could answer in the chat box. Another question that I quickly had is, you talked about moms in the very beginning, but then we went right to a dad. Can infants tell the difference between their moms, and are they used to hearing their moms and their dads' languages?
So at least initially, birth parent gets priority here because a lot of that auditory signal is passed through the body. So it's not really coming in as an external signal. So birth parent for sure has priority early on. However, we know that kids are very, very quick to catch up. And so they start learning from dad on day one. Mom gets a little bit before day one, but dad gets day one.
I remember Pat describing it as listening to the voices of someone through a motel wall.
Yes, very, very muffled.
Wonderful analogy. Could you talk about the research that you've done now on the development of language?
Sure. So when we think about the role of experience in shaping children's language, we start to think about the shift that children make between being that baby universalist and being able to tell the difference between all those sounds and all the languages of the world, and making a shift to becoming this native language specialist. So at what point do children start to make that shift? Turns out it's between about 8 and 10 months of age. So you can see here on this graph, we have on the left-hand side, infants who are exposed to English and infants who are exposed to Japanese. Up until about 8 months of age, they're equally able to hear the difference between the rahs and lahs in the English language, the sounds we played earlier. But over time, you can start to see how that changes. So as you look at infants exposed to English, as they get to about 10 to 12 months of age, the infants who are exposed to English on a daily basis start to get really good at telling the difference between those sounds in the English language. In contrast, infants who are exposed to Japanese start to lose that ability to distinguish those sounds in English. It's not useful for them. Now we know that those children who are exposed to Japanese are conversely, getting much better at hearing and distinguishing those sounds in Japanese. But we're looking here at specifically sounds that exist in the English language. And so you start to see this shift that happens in that sweet spot where the tan line is right there in the middle. We think that that's really that window of opportunity where children are learning so much about the sounds of language. But we're able to use that window of opportunity to really test exactly how children learn language. And so one of the studies that we've done is really investigating the role of social learning in children's language development. And so we brought kids in that very sweet spot between 8 and 10 months of age. These babies were 9 months old. And we wanted to test exactly how they're learning these sounds of language. And so we had some kids who were exposed to Mandarin Chinese through this live interaction, what we expect to be a very good demonstration of the kind of experience children might get every day. Some children saw the same exact presentation, but instead of a live tutor, it was presented to them via DVD. And then a third set of babies came in and heard that same information via audio. Now they also had something to look at, so it was not as if it was stripped away of all, all visual cues. They were looking at a cute little teddy bear on the television screen here, but they were just hearing the audio. And so you have the presentation that really mimics 3 different kinds of experiences that might teach children how to learn language. And we can see a video here of what the live interaction looked like.
就准备好要上月球去玩喽！哦，你看，小熊琪琪在柜子里面找到了飞行船，然后他戴着飞行帽，穿着飞行鞋，准备要上月球去玩喽。好，他的飞行鞋什么颜色的？黄色的哦。好，所以就飞上了天空。
So you can see here that this child is getting a lot of rich experience in that social environment. Though the tutor is not really, touching or really interacting with the baby, but it's this live presentation, this live tutor. You can imagine the DVD simply being a video of this experience, and then the audio group, the kids who heard only the audio, got the same raw content, but without many of the social cues. And so here's what we found. At a very basic level, we're finding that children learn from other people. So this is a similar graph to what we just saw a minute ago, where we were looking at how babies learn, shift from baby universalists to baby specialists during that first year of life. And so here you see exactly that same kind of pattern, that up until about 8 months of age, the babies born in Taiwan and the babies born in Seattle are equally good at distinguishing those sounds in Mandarin Chinese. Now that blue period, that blue bar in the middle, is exactly when we brought kids in. And we know that without intervention, without any sort of experience with Mandarin, the babies who are born in Taiwan are going to get really good at hearing those sounds in Mandarin Chinese, whereas the babies who are born in Seattle are going to start to lose the ability to distinguish those sounds by their first birthday. So the babies in our study who were exposed to Mandarin via that live tutor, after about a month of exposure, 12 sessions, each of them about 25 to 30 minutes, after those sessions, when we tested their ability to distinguish those Mandarin sounds, they looked identical to the babies who spent the first 12 months of life in Taiwan. If nothing else, that's a remarkable amount of learning in a very short period of time. Now, in contrast, when we look and see where the kids who just heard the audio, they showed no evidence of learning anything about the Mandarin sounds. And in fact, the same was true for children who got Mandarin exposure via TV. And so what this really tells us is that the role of that social other is incredibly important for children's learning, at least at this very early age. kids are learning language from the human people in their lives. And I think that's a really important point.
I think people will have a lot of questions about this, like if you introduce it later, will that matter, and so forth. So please
Sure.
put your questions in the Q&A box. We will get to them later. But now I think I want to turn to the implications of some of this research that you share. What should the people who are listening to this and watching this webinar do to promote language development in young children, and particularly if we're thinking about the infants and toddlers you're talking about, particularly for those thinking about those who don't have more formal childcare but use family, friend, or neighbor care, as well as their parents.
Absolutely. You know, I think what research is telling us does in fact have a lot of implications for everyday experiences with children and between children and adults. And we tend to think of these things as these tiny moments in time that really promote children's language development. It doesn't have to be, you know, this language curriculum, though it can be, of course. And I think Pat's going to talk about that in a little bit. But it's these little shifts that you might make in your everyday experiences, in your everyday interactions with children that are really going to matter. So one of the take-home points, and this is something that Pat Kuhl has studied for many, many years, is the phenomenon of the tone of voice called parentese. So parentese is the speech that is directed to infants and toddlers. It's that sing-song tone of voice that you might tend to use with children. So in this graph, for example, you might say, "Do you want to play with your big red truck?" So it's sort of sing-song. You can see that there's, you know, more of a contour in the tone of voice that you use. You tend to use slower speech, though it has real words and real grammatical structure. And I think that's important because it's a contrast to what you might think of traditionally as baby talk. That's not what we're talking about here. Real words, real grammar, sing-song tone of voice, simpler grammar, and, you know, a little bit slower, particularly with those elongated vowels. And so using parentese turns out to be incredibly effective. And we can show another example here of what parentese also looks like. You might say, "You do? Okay, let's play with your big red truck." And again, with this infographic, we're also thinking about making sure your child has plenty of time to respond. This is not a story where we're thinking about the child as an empty vessel that we need to fill with words, right? I mean, we're wanting to think about this back and forth interaction that turns out to be very powerful. And if we look at some data to show the effect of parentese on children's language development, you see that it's really profound because parentese does in fact boost language. And so here you'll see in this left-hand graph that when children are 12 months of age, the more they hear infant-directed speech or parentese, the more they babble. And babble is, of course, practice for later talking. We also know that the more the infants hear infant-directed speech or parentese at 12 months of age, the higher their vocabulary at 24 months of age. You know, to a certain degree, we think of parentese as, you know, being a spotlight for children who are learning language. It says, "Hey, baby, I'm talking to you. This is important." There's a lot of noise in the world of babies, a lot of, you know, adult talk that's happening in the background. And this is really one way to say, you know, this is important. Pay attention to me. So we think of it as a highlighter. But we also know that it does exactly the kinds of things that help with language learning later on. You know, if you've ever been in a foreign country, or, you know, a part of town where you didn't speak the language, you know, one sentence can sound like one very long run-on word. But by putting these exaggerated pauses between words, you really help children with that exact process of language learning. So I mentioned the importance of back and forth interaction before, and that is in fact true. And we've done some research looking at exactly what that looks like. This is some research I did looking and comparing children's ability to learn words from traditional video via video chat. And it turns out that kids learn new words from video chat much, much earlier than they're able to learn from traditional screen media, because it has that back and forth interaction. Yes, it's over screens, but you're able to have that conversation as you would if the person was, you know, real right in front of you. And so that seems to be very important. But the kinds of social cues that we're thinking about are not limited to these sort of back and forth interactions. We know that all the other pieces of social cues, like eye gaze, pointing, these gestures we might use, these also help children's learning over time. In this graph, you'll see some data looking at how children build their vocabularies over time. You know, the average child, by the time they're about 24 months of age, has about 300 or so words in their productive vocabulary. But children who are really good at following the social cues of a social partner or an adult tend to have almost 200 more words in their productive vocabularies by the time they're 2. That's enormous. You know, and as adults, one of the things that we can think about is giving children the time and space to really latch on to those social cues. We have to slow our pace a little bit, match the child's mood, you know, and their own pace of things, and talk about what they're talking about, because that's what they're interested in. And so when we think about what this really looks like in practice, we're thinking about a number of things, a number of features of these everyday interactions that really help children learn. Things like asking those open-ended questions that invite a response that will, you know, really be the foundation for that back and forth interaction. We're thinking about following the child's lead. We know that children learn new words, new language based on what they're already interested in. It's so much harder to redirect a child's attention to what you want to talk about. So talk about what they are interested in instead. We're thinking about commenting on discoveries, like, how did you do that? Or what made you think that? Again, inviting that curiosity, which builds, you know, skills and domains beyond language, but is also good for language development. Co-playing with children. Lots of these playful experiences are really the core of what builds children's language development. And then thinking about exploring in new ways. Again, very useful for building skills beyond the language domain, but very central to learning language and building vocabulary. So I wanted to just mention one additional piece here, which is that, you know, as much as we're thinking about what nuggets here really promote children's language learning, we know that if you teach parents and help parents and show them what these moments look like, it in fact works. And you are able to change parents' language behavior with their children, and in turn change children's language development. We've done a study recently here at iLabs looking at this parent coaching model, where we brought parents in at a variety of ages at 6, 10, 14, and 18 months of age, and gave them feedback on recordings from their language that they have taken at home, and said, you know, you were using Parentese here, or that was a great opportunity, you know, when you were doing that diaper change, that was a great opportunity for you to really have that good interaction with your child. So we gave them feedback on these audio samples, and we listened to them in these coach sessions. We talked about upcoming language milestones so that parents would be ready for them when they happen. So, you know, what does a first word sound like? And what are you going to do when you hear it? And then we'd also talk about finding these times in our very, very busy everyday lives for interactivity. Times like book sharing, times like, you know, driving and dropping, you know, somebody off at daycare or at elementary school. Car rides are a good time for this. Diaper changes are a good time for the one-on-one interaction. All of these opportunities that parents could really boost their children's language. And just a snapshot of some of the results that I think are very exciting here. We showed that parent coaching works. And so if you look over time, you know, the language that parents are directing to their child increases over time. The percentage of Parentese that parents are using increases over time and relative to control group. And then children are babbling more. And I've already shown you data that we know that children who are babbling more, that's practice for later speaking. And I will tell you that more recent results have also shown that children's vocabulary increases as well. So we're very excited about these results, because I think that they show not only that, you know, that these everyday experiences are so important, but that you can really change parent behavior if you intentionally coach on some of these pieces. So with that, I will just point you to the iLabs training modules that Yoli mentioned initially. They're available for free on our website, but they are about 20 minutes long. They're free to access, available in a variety of languages, and provide, you know, a quick snapshot of the latest research in a variety of areas, including language development, but not limited to language development. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Ellen.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate how concrete you've been. I think you've given us all ways to talk to the children in our lives. Now we're going to switch to Pat Kuhl, and Pat is going to bring her slides up, and we're going to talk about what Pat has learned from the brain science.
Hi, Ellen, and hi, everybody. I am so excited to join this group today to talk about this incredibly important topic of the bilingual brain and language in development more generally, and how it is that our children learn in the way that Sarah was showing. And so what I want to share with you today is some information that we have that dovetails with the stuff that Sarah was providing for you about learning. Early learning is absolutely amazing. Children are learning at a rate that is hard to understand. And the question I want to pose is, what does the brain have to do with it? And of course, my answer to that is a lot. The brain has a lot to do with this incredible learning that we see in very, very young children exposed to language. So one of the first messages that I think it's important for parents to grasp is that we're actually building the mind of the child. The baby brain comes well equipped with all of the parts. Think of it as a corporation in which there are various areas of that corporation that are specializing in particular things. That's what the baby brain is like. Visual information, when the baby sees something, goes to the back of the head exactly where it's supposed to go. Auditory information goes to the auditory cortex on the above the ear on the left and the right side. Social information to the social areas, etc. But what's missing is the connections between them. And we begin to understand how our experiences in talking and interacting and engaging children builds that mind and brain. And the methods we're using are very, very incredible and new. The best of modern neuroscience we see here, and I'll show you another one of these. The baby in a magnetoencephalography machine, completely safe and non-invasive. And we can, with this kind of technique, get a movie of the activity in a child's brain as the baby engages in a problem, like listening to the sounds of language or listening to words or seeing the mother's face. And at the same time that we can study brain function, we can do a different kind of measurement using magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, and you see here sections of the brain and that wonderful connectivity, the telephone wires that are allowing the areas of the brain to talk to one another. Nothing important that we do takes place if we don't have this connectivity between the areas of the brain. So what we're trying to understand is, when in development do we see the functional abilities of the brain, and when do we see this connectivity grow, and what do we have to do with the growth of that baby brain? So all of this research is leading us to some truths about how the baby brain does it, and it's allowing us to go from research to practice. And you heard a couple of the examples that Sarah gave, the Parentese, the interventions that we've looked at to see how parents play a role in building the mind of the child. And so let's start some of this work of looking at the brain by taking a very simple curve and understanding brain growth. So this plot, this graph, just shows you the size of a person's brain at various times in development. The surprising thing is how rapidly the size of the brain approaches adult size. So if you look at 5 years of age, the brain is 92% of its total size in relation to adults. That's the time we send children to school. And by 1 year, Sarah was telling you about the changes that occur between 6 months and 12 months. By 1 year of age, that baby brain is 70% of its total size. So there's huge growth going on early in development, and it's playing a role in this tremendous learning that you see children do. So let's look at one of the factors that's making the brain grow, and here it is. We know that neurons have to talk to one another in order to communicate messages. And neurons in the gray matter, you can see at birth, there are 86 billion neurons that exist at birth. And that's practically all you'll have throughout your life. But what's not there at birth is the wiring, the synapses that allow junctures between the two and many neurons so that they can communicate with one another. What develops in a very rapid way between birth and 3 years of age are the synapses. And by 3 years, you see 3 times the number of synapses that you and I have in our adult brains. So you have this rapid proliferation of connectivity in the baby brain. And then something quite interesting happens. The brain actually prunes connections that it doesn't need, does this all over the brain. And by the end of puberty, and you can see it in the panel showing the 14-year-old, you can see that by 14 years of age, there are fewer connections than there were at 3 years of age. So this process of rapid connectivity is allowing that child to learn just about anything. Multiple languages, many things about the world, the habits, the values, how objects work, how people behave in this culture. Cultural learning takes place while the brain is in this excited period of growth. And then as the brain settles on what's important to that culture, the language, the values, and the habits, then you see this sort of solidification and pruning, which is actually very good for the brain because, like a rose bush, you prune it to develop stronger remaining connections. So as the baby brain prunes, you end up with a teenage brain at the end of the pubescence. You have a very, very strongly structured, a brain that's really ready for adult work. And one more and newer way that we're measuring the child's brain is not the short range connections that are represented by synapses, but what we call white matter long range connections that go across the entire brain and connect all these vision, auditory, social, and prefrontal cortex that controls attention. And so what you see here on the top, a view of the side of the brain, and at the bottom, a view from the top of the brain at 3 ages. On the left, the 7-monther, in the middle, the 11-monther, and at the right, the 26-monther. And the color coding indicates how myelinated this white matter is. Myelin is a sheath that covers the wiring so that the information can travel much, much faster. So the more yellow you see that brain, the more connectivity and the more rapid connectivity. So what's amazing to me as I look at this brain is to see how between 7 and 26 months, how incredibly connected that baby brain is. I mean, it's simply amazing. No wonder our 3-year-olds can ask us all these questions and make decisions for themselves and surprise us almost every day with the information that they know and what they can ask of us. So with this as a backdrop of, you know, what's happening physiologically, the brain is growing at a rapid rate, developing and then pruning synapses, and these long-range connections are really growing strong. Well, let's compare that to a learning curve that comes out of psychology. And what we see here, this graph portrays the ability of all of us to learn a second language and how it depends on the age that we are when we attempt to learn that new language. So if you find your age at the bottom and find your skill level on the left-hand margin, the y-axis, you'll see that, you know, between the ages of 0 at birth and 7 years of age, children are really quite literally geniuses at learning a second language. But then every 2 years after the age of 7, you can, across many studies, this cartoon represents many studies, it shows that there's a decline in the ability to master the grammar, to master the phonology, the sounds and how they are combined, and the rules of pluralization and other mechanics of a language. And so biologists call this a critical period. There's a period in development. You can think of it as an opportunity, a golden opportunity for the brain to be influenced by culture and the environment. And for language, that magical period occurs between 0 and 7 years of age.
I'd love to take a deeper peek under the hood, Pat, and look at what you found from using the Meg machine and studying the development of children's language.
All right, well, that's a great question, because what a neuroscientist does is turn to, you know, big machines. What you see here is a magnetoencephalography machine. It looks like a hairdryer from Mars. It is quite big, but it's completely safe and non-invasive. And what it allows us to do, it's also silent. So when anyone of any age sits in this big machine, we have 9 different sizes of chairs, we can actually see what's going on in the brain as a problem is solved. And so here's our little 6-monther. This is Emma. She's sitting in the very big machine and she's very comfortable and the machine is on. And so you can hear that it's practically silent. She's listening to sounds and words from many languages through insert earphones. And she's watching something, so she's entertained. And what we're trying to do is get an idea, how do these things that Sarah was telling you about, how does it change between 6 and 12 months? What is it that allows the baby to learn so much better under the social learning conditions when it's complex and there are people interacting and there's another baby next to you, as opposed to when you're just staring at a DVD. And when we get under the hood, as Sarah was, as Ellen was just saying, we can see the areas of the brain. I've got them labeled here, some of them. We're focused on auditory areas because that's where the signal is going to the auditory areas. But this other area, Broca's area, is important because that's how children talk back. That's how children engage. That's how they're socially responsive. And as we play sounds to the baby, this is a sound from the baby's own language, there is a surprising outcome of the study showing that it's not only the auditory cortex that's lighting up, but this Broca's cortex, this area of the brain that the child uses to engage with us, to talk back. And we've seen in our studies that this activity occurs as early as 6 months, before children are doing much talking at all. Many of them haven't started to babble yet. So what we think is happening is that as we talk to a baby, and as Sarah was showing you that Parentese engages the baby brain, what's happening is we're turning on the circuitry that links listening to speaking and starts the social dance. Babies begin to rehearse what it's going to be like to join the social conversation, to really engage themselves in the language activity. So here's an instance where the tools of modern neuroscience can tell us something that we didn't know in any other way. All of the behavioral studies say the babies are learning, but don't explain how the social brain actually turns on learning in a way that's special. And these studies begin to tell us exactly how that learning is going on. So I'm going to next turn to this question of what's the bilingual brain doing? We've got some hints as to what is happening in the monolingual brain, but how is it that babies are learning bilingually if they're exposed simultaneously from birth? Let's say mother speaking Spanish, father speaking English. Many people in America still are under the impression, the incorrect impression, that babies get confused. So we use the MEG machine to examine and compare monolingual 11-monthers to bilingual 11-monthers. So I'll show you a little movie narrated by Naya Farhan Ramirez, who is the first author on our work on bilingualism. You'll see how we test babies in the MEG machine. So here's that little clip.
First, we brought the 11-month-old babies into the lab with their parents. Half of the babies were from monolingual, English-only households. The other half of the babies, such as the one in this video, were from Spanish-English bilingual households. Our researchers first prepared the babies for data collection. They used a hat and a special digitizing pen to track the shape of the baby's head. This procedure allowed us to continuously monitor the baby's head position as they moved in the scanner. Then we brought the babies into the MEG room. They sat on a special high chair beneath the MEG helmet with their parents sitting nearby. The babies listened to a stream of sounds such as da's and ta's. Some of the sounds were specific to English and Spanish, and some were common to both languages. Da, 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 da. When we looked at the brain responses, we found that at 11 months of age, the brains of monolingual babies are specialized in processing the sounds of English and are not sensitive to the sounds of Spanish. The brains of bilingual babies, on the other hand, are specialized to process both languages, Spanish and English.
So you can see this amazing learning that the bilingual babies are doing. Their responses to English are just as strong in the brain as monolinguals' responses to English. So there is no confusion going on.
I'm really interested that there have been articles about the impact of language on dual language learners and executive function skills. And I'd love you to talk about this. And for those of you wondering about the time, I think this is so important that I'm going to let the time run a little bit longer. So you will have a good chance to hear Linda too. Pat, I'm going to keep this going for about another 7 minutes, and then we'll switch to Linda, and we'll go a little bit over the hour period. So each of you has a full chance to talk.
All right, that sounds great. That sounds great. Well, let me quickly show. That's such a good question. What did we see that was different between the bilingual baby brain and the monolingual baby brain at 11 months? And you see an area of the brain here lit up. It's the prefrontal cortex. When bilingual babies listen to language, their prefrontal cortices are much more active. What's that prefrontal cortex doing? It's switching between the two languages. What a bilingual does is excite the circuitry for one language as opposed to another, and that switching is happening in prefrontal cortex. This happens to be good for the brain. It's beneficial with regard to the diagnosis of Alzheimer's being lower in people, in adults who have bilingual experience, and also cognitive aging is slower. So it's a very, very good thing for the brain. Now, we also can see the benefits of this enhanced prefrontal cortex in little problems that bilingual babies solve more easily than monolingual babies. So one of the executive functions, there are quite a few, one of them has to do with your cognitive flexibility. What that means is how readily do you solve a brand new problem? What we see is a baby size, 11-month size problem. A child is sitting in a chair with a plexiglass box with toy being put in the box that the child can get. But only one door of this plexiglass box is open. Let's see how the child learns to pull it out. So there goes the toy. The box is open on what is your left. And the baby's job is to pull it out of there. And they like the toy, so they're highly motivated. Okay, so you can see that this monolingual child, no problem. Every child can solve the problem at this phase. Phase 2 gets harder. So now we take the box and turn it around. Now the door is open on the other side, and the baby has to solve this brand new baby-sized problem. And like we all do, this child goes back to the solution that worked before. The door was open on what we see as left, and so they keep going back. She doesn't solve this problem in the time allowed. Now let's look at the same problem in a bilingual baby. The door first open on the left, and like all children, they figure it out and pull it out. Actually, the hardest thing for them is to give it back, right? They have to give back the toy.
Good job. Can I have them?
And then the box gets moved around and the door's on the right. Like others, they turn first to that old side, but then you can see this child is highly successful in pulling it out. So what we learn by this is that the bilingual experience, even by 11 months, is very, very good for babies. So what do you take with this information? If you know how rapidly language is being learned, you know that bilingual babies have full capability to learn more than one. What we did was to work on a method and curriculum to bring second language learning to infant education centers all over the world. And our brain-based, research-based method and curriculum is called SparkLing. And we've done 2 experiments in Madrid, Spain. Why did we go to Madrid? Because Madrid has all of its children in neighborhood schools from the age of 4 months on. Parents pay only what they can afford, and the schools are right in their neighborhoods. They're very, very high quality education settings. And we, in 2016, we took a group of undergraduates from the University of Washington for their junior year abroad, and we used a method in an hour a day that consisted of everything we'd learned from the research: high quantity of language input, high quality input in the form of Parentese, highly social with interactive games and activities, and encourage children. Remember that brain research that says when you talk to children, their brains are getting ready to talk back, even if they're just babbling. We encouraged even the babies to babble back, multiple native speakers providing input, and very play-based social instruction with weekly themes. And so this method was used in Madrid. There's some of our tutors in the blue shirt there in the various groups and the games that we played. And the kids would have fun in these settings, and the learning data was amazing. This is a randomized control trial with the CPC in blue. That's the community practice. That is our control here. So that's Madrid's typical bilingual approach. At the beginning of the experiment, with regard to their knowledge of vocabulary in English, the experimental group in red and the control group in blue were equally good. After 18 weeks of 1 hour a day, you can see that the intervention group's learning of English words far surpasses the community practice control group, and they're learning amazingly rapidly. You can see also in the number of utterances, this is English vocalizations per child per hour at the start in the intervention group and then after the 18 weeks. And when you break it down by age, what we're showing here is the number of vocalizations per child per hour per day and in the 4 age groups, from the earliest 7 to 14 months to the oldest 27 to 33 months. And you see these huge gains by the intervention group. So children who experienced this iLabs method and curriculum showed extraordinary gains. We were so excited by the first experiment. But we can't take it to the world if we're training all the tutors in person, which is what we had done in that first experiment. So we invented at iLabs a software that would teach the method and curriculum. So here's just a couple of pages from a software program. It takes about 3 weeks to train a teacher or a tutor, and we teach them how to use the method and all of its principles that you saw on that slide. We also teach them how the brain is being wired by this experience that the children are having in the program. And again, in 2018, when we've been back and trained in many more schools, trained many teachers and tutors for now 13 different schools, 800 children, we replicated the effects and showed tremendous learning when the teachers, tutors were trained with the software and not in person. So the games are very playful, it's very intense, it's very fun. The hour a day was effective even in the poorest neighborhoods in Madrid with children of migrant workers whose parents could not read. They started out much lower with their English and Spanish skills, but we could see that they gained tremendously. And all of them graduated the program, as you can see here, and it was lovely. It allows us to imagine bringing bilingual education to all of the children of the world.
I think you are thinking about that, Pat, aren't you? You're thinking about how now to do this in the United States, and let's talk about that in the question and answer period.
Yes, we're very excited to bring this to the dual language learners in the United States. That's the next step.
But what's particularly exciting about this is that you've not only figured out what are the what happens with dual language learners, but also how you take a good early childhood program and use that with dual language learners, and now how to transmit it. So this is very exciting. We're going to grow the children up now, and I'm thrilled to switch to Linda Espinosa, whom I've had the privilege of working with for many years since we were on the board of NAYC together. So Linda, let's begin. There's so much information and misinformation about dual language learners, and we've been seeing a little bit of that in the Q&A section. Let's talk about what does science tell us about the best approaches to bilingualism and long-term success of dual language learners?
Hey, and thank you for including me in this very important webinar. So what I'm going to talk about today is from a little bit of a broader perspective. What does the research tell us in general about effective educational approaches to promote kindergarten readiness for dual? Sound okay? All right. And then I also want to address where are some of the areas where we have real knowledge gaps. We may have a few studies, but we simply don't have enough to have confidence in a particular approach. So one thing that everybody virtually agrees upon is the urgency to address these issues within our dual language population. Because this population of children we serve is more diverse than ever in the early care and education field, and both in terms of the proportion of children who speak a language other than English in the home, and in the numbers of different languages that children coming into our early care and education settings speak with their families.
Linda, could you talk in a little bit louder voice? Your voice is fading in and out.
Oh, sorry. Okay, luckily I had the PowerPoints will fill in, hopefully, some of the wording. But, so it's a diverse group that's growing in size and in numbers of different languages. So in the United States, I'm going to move back just a little bit. So in the United States, the numbers of dual language learners has grown about 24% since the year 2000, up to, and I think Yoli mentioned this number, about 32% of all children ages birth to 5 actually are counted as dual language learners. In California, which is our most diverse state, the number is extraordinarily high at about 60% of children ages birth to 5 speaking a language other than English in the home. And I don't know if we've mentioned the proportion in Head Start, but it's now just about a third. Okay, I guess we're going to move ahead. The one thing that I wanted to say about the previous slide was that we have anywhere from 75 to 145 different languages in different communities. And as has been mentioned throughout this webinar, there are achievement discrepancies that we're seeing actually as early as 3 years of age, definitely at kindergarten entry, 3rd grade, 4th grade reading and math scores, high school completion, college enrollment, college completion, et cetera. But I do want to point out before we go too much further that much of this achievement discrepancy, or what we commonly call the achievement gap, is really a function of how we assess these children. Because typically in the vast majority of the assessments, they're in English only. So that the educators don't really get a full sense of the capabilities and the language strengths that the children have, other than what either they do or don't know in English, which we know is not the full story. So consequently, typically, DLLs are underestimated. Their academic potential is underestimated from the time they enter an early care setting or kindergarten. So what do we know? What is science telling us about how the best approaches to promote early bilingualism and long-term success for dual language learners? And that's the next slide. Luckily, along with the growth in the proportion in the numbers of languages, we actually have an emergent scientific base, some of which is informed by Pat's research, which was wonderful. If we could go to the next slide, please. Well, okay. So thank you. So luckily, along with this explosion of dual language learners in our early care and education settings, we also have a fairly large emerging research base that can inform our practices and help to dispel some of those myths that that Ellen mentioned early on in the webinar. One of the best sources for a comprehensive synthesis of all of our evidence base around how to best serve and meet the needs of dual language learners is a recent report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. So this report came out in 2017, and it was a consensus study of 17 scholars from very diverse fields. We had demographers, sociologists, psycholinguists, and luckily I was honored to be the educational representative on this 2.5-year committee. So this committee actually studied dual language learners from birth through age 21, and it's the only study of its kind that's really looked at not just early childhood or elementary or secondary, but really looked at the continuum of children from birth all the way through to high school, or in some cases college preparation and completion. So what have we found? What we did in the book, and of course it's a 500-plus page book that originally was 900 pages, so a lot of us had a lot to say in this volume. But what we did was we narrowed it down to those findings that had consistency across rather rigorous studies. So studies that we had confidence in because they were representative, they were well designed, and their findings held up across settings, age groups, and different language groups. So basically, I'll quickly go through what some of the major findings were in the birth to 5 arena. As you heard this morning from both Sarah and Pat, the infants and toddlers and preschoolers, all infants, toddlers, and preschoolers have the capacity to learn more than one language. And balanced bilingualism carries significant social, linguistic, cognitive, and cultural benefits. So what that means is that oftentimes educators or policymakers, and actually policies, state policies, up until very recently, often recommended that you not start a second language until kindergarten. Actually, that was a policy in the state of California until probably about 6 or 7 years ago. So there was a common misunderstanding that infants, and particularly infants from low-income backgrounds, that it was taking all of their cognitive energy to learn one language, and that adding a second language during those years was probably going to delay their overall language development and create an extra burden on their cognitive capacities. When, as you've heard today from Pat and Sarah, and other studies bear out entirely, that there could be nothing that's more false. I think one of the challenges for adults is to understand that babies learn language in very different ways than adults. So that as you saw, as you get older, your neurological cognitive capacity to hear and learn languages starts to be reduced. So as adults, we think about language learning from our perspective, when in fact, now that we have this wonderful neurological research from the neuroscientists, we know that babies are, as has been said, linguistic geniuses, and we just aren't. So we have to compare. We shouldn't think about it from our perspective, but really learn about what the science is telling us. So the other thing that we know is that dual language learners with more balanced bilingual skills show the greatest advantages. So a child who has relatively equal competencies in 2 or more languages reaps those cognitive benefits that Pat talked about, and others, metalinguistic skills, social skills, et cetera, and a kind of a school readiness profile that prepares them for school success. The other thing that this report describes is studies such as Pat's that tell us that when children have a second language exposure before 3 years of age, and I'm talking about studies in the United States that are looking at long-term English proficiency and academic success in English, that when that bilingual exposure is before 3 years of age, that these children have the best outcomes in English and the best academic records. And actually, their academic performance in the long term is higher than monolinguals. So children who have more than one language, who become fully proficient in 2 languages, outscore monolinguals in tests of math, reading, and science, by the high school years. The fourth area that we feel very confident about, and it's been mentioned as well, is that we need competent speakers of a language. So whatever language that you're speaking to the child in, and as you saw, it can be any of a variety of languages, because they will learn it. But it's important that that speaker have mastery of the language that they're using, and that they have sufficient exposure. And again, this is an area where we need a lot more research, but a couple of studies have suggested that the amount of exposure to fully learn a language is anywhere from about 29 to 40%. But what we need to know more about are specific curricular approaches to promoting early bilingualism during the early childhood years and across different contexts. So we have group care settings, we have family-based child care, we have child care centers, community-based child care centers, and we have families who provide child care to their relatives. So there are lots of different settings and configurations where children can be and are exposed to different languages. Oh, thank you. So what the next set of findings include the characteristics of those language interactions. So they need to be frequent, responsive to the child's interests, expanded, and varied. And again, this is just an expansion of what Pat was talking about, but many other studies have found similar things, which is that especially for infants and toddlers, you follow the child's cue. What are they interested in? You respond to that, and then you expand it, and you start using adverbs and adjectives, and you start using more complex grammar and using topics and vocabulary that might seem a little above the child's level of understanding, but you don't stop talking to the child just because you're not sure if they understand you. The next one is, we have learned over and over again, and this is no surprise in early childhood, that oral language skills are extremely important during these birth to 5 years. And those seem to be the areas where dual language learners show the largest gaps in English simply because they haven't had opportunities to hear and speak and engage with extended conversation with both their peers and with adults. And as I mentioned earlier, strong and L1 in this case refers to home language, so stronger home language and English skills at kindergarten predicted the best school outcomes. Again, the home language, and we haven't talked about that too much today, but we do know this across many, many studies, but it must be explicitly and systematically supported. Otherwise, it will decline once dual language children are introduced or exposed to English in an early care and education setting. So again, what we need to know more about are these different programmatic approaches. For instance, when do you start a second language? How much? By whom? For what purposes? And what are the variations in that across different settings that will lead to high language proficiency in the long run? Okay. Our final set of findings that we have strong evidence on includes specific instructional approaches and strategies. And while we know certain things, that we know that certain instructional approaches are critical, that basic good language interactions are necessary, but that there are additional scaffolding or adaptive strategies that teachers need to implement for dual language learners in order for those children to become bilingual. And also frequent assessment. This is a huge area for our field, especially the formative aspect of it, where we continually watch, observe, and monitor children's progress in both languages. And that's the kicker right there, in both languages. So we need to do a lot of work on our assessment tools and methods. Our 11th finding is that families must be involved in the education of dual language learners. We literally cannot do this by ourselves. Families are critical to the process at every step of the way, beginning at enrollment. And I'm going to talk about that a little more in a minute. The final thing is that early care and education teachers need specific training and competencies to meet the needs of dual language learners. And unfortunately, often those competencies that we know are important are not part of their teacher preparation programs. So our final set of findings have to do with home language loss. And I want to talk about that a little bit because obviously it's important for dual language learners to have strong English skills to be successful in American schools. However, the importance of maintaining and continuing to attend to the development of home language has sometimes been lost in our schooling system, but we know it's critical for personal, social, cultural, educational, and economic reasons. So we can't ignore that growth and development when we are attending to English acquisition. And unfortunately, the record in our studies in the United States tends to show that once children enter into an early childhood program, whether it's Head Start, state preschool, or a child care center even, that they do start to lose their home language. They start to lose both their preference for speaking it and their ability to grow and learn additional content from that home language. And sometimes parents are misinformed and feel like they should promote English at home because that's the language of the school, when in fact that is not consistent with what we know, that families really need to be encouraged to continue to speak their home language or the dominant language of the home for lots of different reasons. I mean, obviously language development, but other reasons related to cultural features of development as well as family connections and family dynamics. The other thing we know, and maybe you'll recognize the conundrum here, is that the earlier children are exposed to English in a formalized setting, the more likely they will lose their home language and the quicker that will happen. So we have a little conundrum here, and I have some recommendations for how to prevent that. And one of them is work.
I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I know you have a lot more to share with us. Could you please do it in about the next 4 or 5 minutes so that we have at least 10 minutes for questions? And if you wouldn't mind holding your cell phone up just a little closer, maybe the sound would be a bit better. This is really incredible, and I don't want people to miss it.
I'm sorry. So are you losing my sound?
It's coming in and out for me. I don't know about others, but we can hear you and see the words. But if you held it up a little bit, it probably would be better.
Okay, I'll hold it up. Okay, is this better?
That sounds great, Linda, yes.
Yeah. And if we could just go for about 4 more minutes so that we could have about 10 minutes for questions, that would be great. Thank you.
Let's cut out the teacher qualifications then, okay? We'll go to best practices. So we'll go to the next slide. Yes, thank you. Well, go back one. Okay, so I did want to make the point that currently across the states, there are no consistent criteria for identifying who is a dual language learner during the pre-K years. And that creates some issues in counting and understanding how large this population of children is, what languages they speak in the home, et cetera. Nor do we have standard requirements for teacher qualifications for early care and education teachers who work with families. So we need better assessment tools and methods with common criteria at every stage, at the identification, at formative assessment, and when we're doing kindergarten entry assessments, because we're biased in favor of only English. And clearly across the country and within each state, we need some common understandings of what are those qualifications that teachers need to have to work effectively with DLLs. Let's go ahead and skip the next 2 slides about individual differences, because I can address those maybe in Q&A, and move to the basic principles. Yes, thank you. Okay, so considering all of that research and all of that recommendations, what we know then is as the basic principle of best practices for early care and education for DLLs. So we know early proficiency in the home language and English at kindergarten entry is critical to becoming academically proficient in the second language, and that consistent approaches to pre-K grade 3 will support that ongoing achievement. For instance, if you have a dual language program at pre-K, it would be important for schools to maintain that specific dual language approach through K3 so that they do become fully bilingual. Systematic exposure to English and ongoing support of home language is critical. Let me just mention the next 2 slides real quickly. Our language approaches for dual language learners. In California, we have reviewed the research and come up with 2 recommendations around a language approach or a language model. So there's the dual language model, which is our most highly recommended model. And that would mean that it's a balanced approach where you have approximately equal time to 2 or more languages, and that they receive content in both languages and can learn subject matter in both languages. That is ideal. That prepares children to become fully bilingual, biliterate, bicultural, and successful academically. Unfortunately, those programs are not common. They tend to be fairly rare, although they are growing in California and across the country. What we have in California, the proportion of early care and education programs that are serving DLOs have adopted a primarily English with support for home language, and that's about 85% in the state of California, unfortunately, because we're still recovering, I think, from the effects of Prop 227, which actually prohibited bilingual education. But we're past that now. We're now in a set of policies that encourage dual language programming and bilingualism for all children, actually. So what we have developed is a set of strategies that all staff can implement to support all DLLs. So even though most of our staff, most of our teachers and support staff, actually most of our teachers are monolingual English speakers, some of our support staff do speak languages other than English. So we developed a set of strategies where all providers, whether they are dual language learners themselves or monolingual English speakers, can promote early bilingualism. We felt that was our most pressing priority to achieve short-term bilingualism and long-term academic success. So global high quality is important but not sufficient. So there are additional set of strategies that are extremely important for this population. And if we can do the next slide, I'll very quickly say what that is on that. And so we developed a set of strategies called Personalized Oral Language Learning, or POL, which includes 3 primary elements: a set of strategies for working with families, a set of strategies that address the environmental supports, and a set of instructional and assessment strategies that specifically guide teachers on methods to support different languages when the teacher does not support them, and how to assess young children in multiple languages. So I think I'm out of time, maybe over time.
Thank you so much. Yoli, will you go and switch us to our questions, please?
Yes, so let me start off, and we'll get to as many questions as we can in the next 8 minutes. And if we don't get to all the questions, we will have our panelists respond to them, and then we will include them in the post-webinar email that you'll get in about a week. And before I start the first question, let me just make sure you know, and you probably see this on your screen, it's the poll to let us know what you thought about this webinar. Really important to get your feedback. So first question from Adrian Pedrosa. He's a colleague and partner at Abriendo Puertas. His question is, we hear from families across the country experiencing stresses of immigration status, poverty, family separation. Can you talk about how adverse childhood experiences impacts brain development? And I'm just gonna read a couple, Ellen, so that you can feel them. Frank Cardella, moving beyond bilingual to multilingual, what is the tipping point where the number of novel sounds becomes cacophonous and we actually begin to see a decrease in mental flexibility? So 2 very different questions. I'll let you field them to the panelists that you think can best respond.
So Pat, do you want to start about adversity?
Right. Obviously, there is strong evidence that extreme adversity is very, very harmful for the brain. All of those early connections that I said were growing, the synaptic connections, the long-range fiber tracts, there's evidence that if children are extremely stressed, toxic stress, that this interrupts the process. So less extreme, but also important, is the very foundational notion that both Sarah and I addressed, that learning occurs in a social context. The social context is a give and take. It's highly positive. What we're doing is engaging that brain socially. And if a child is afraid, if a child is threatened, if a child is not growing up in a reasonably happy and supportive and trusting environment, it does interrupt learning. So we have to say that as a first principle, that babies first establish trust and love, and then they learn amazingly. But that stress and the lack of a supportive social context makes a huge difference.
So we need to think about dual language learners in the context of giving them positive relationships.
Absolutely. It starts with those first relationships and grows from there.
And Linda, do you want to respond to the second one?
And tell me again what that point was about the number of different languages.
The question was moving beyond bilingual to multilingual. What is the tipping point where the number of novel sounds becomes cacophonous and we actually begin to see a decrease in mental flexibility?
Or any of the three of you who would like to respond to that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Linda. Yeah.
Oh, no, well, I don't do the research on the brain's capacity to process different sounds during the birth to 5 years, but I think that, Pat, that's your area.
Or Sarah.
Yeah, so let me jump in to say we actually don't scientifically know the answer to the question, is there a limit to the brain's capacity to learn languages? We can't answer that question. Obviously, the more languages you know, and we have all heard of people who know 6, 7, 8 languages, that it's taking up a lot of real estate up there with many languages, but we can't draw a line and say up to this you can learn, but then beyond that you can't. It's just one of the frontiers of science to figure out how that growing number of languages that you try to learn is impeded or not. We know that if you have been exposed to 2 earlier, you find it easier to learn a 3rd and a 4th. So there's something about languages themselves that make you have a greater capacity for additional languages. We also know that it's not impossible to learn a second language after puberty. While the graph shows it's much harder, I think you use totally different brain machinery and do it in a different, more cognitive way. It's not that implicit learning that's characteristic of early childhood. But we know you can do it. It's just different mental machinery. So those are all interesting questions for the future. But Europeans prove over and again that trilinguals and people who know 4 languages, they're doing beautifully. So I don't think we have to worry about there being a capacity limit here.
And I will say personally that I have a grandson who grew up in Europe and who speaks 5 languages. But remember, you're learning it naturally and you're learning it over time.
Exactly.
So
Linda, this question is directed at you. If dual language learning is the best method, better than most English with support for L1, how do we support students and families and communities where multiple languages are spoken? We know that's a big challenge.
Right, and that's a reality right now, because even in the schools that I ran, we were able to run bilingual programs because we had 2 major languages, Spanish and English. And in those schools right now, they probably have 7, 8, 9, or 10 different languages. So I think for programming purposes, the main thing you can do is identify which are your main language groups. And if you have 2, say Spanish and Mandarin or something like that, it would be possible to set up bilingual programs. And even if you don't have sufficient numbers of Mandarin-speaking bilingual teachers, they can pair with monolingual English-speaking teachers to run a dual language program so the children move back and forth between the different classrooms and teachers depending upon either the time of day or the day of the week or the week. So I think the important thing is to identify how many different language groups you really have, what are the primary ones, and is there the possibility of grouping so that you can support dual language learning opportunities. The second, I think, method because we may have a scattering of low incidence languages and primarily English-speaking languages or English-speaking teachers. And that's very common in rural areas. I know in Iowa, when I was working there in some of the rural areas with recent resettlement patterns and whatnot. So what I recommend there is really this English language. You recognize that you have English language primarily, but these specific strategies will support all of the languages that you have. Bring them into the classroom, bring the language into the classroom, bring the cultures into the classroom so that children can see and hear and talk with that native language, and it will be supported and maintained and hopefully developed.
I wanted to thank everyone. I know we're at 4:30, and I think that what this webinar has shown that there's that the research is showing us not only that it's beneficial, contrary to the myths, if you can learn more than 2 languages or more, if you can learn them well, but that we're out of sync in practice, that there's a real gap between what we do and what we know. And so I think having the communities for the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on the phone together where we can begin to translate the science into action is really important. Yoli, are there ways to continue this conversation with this incredible panel?
Well, first, we will do a follow-up email for all the participants. There were over 130 or 40 that participated, and we didn't get to all the questions, obviously, so we'll respond to those that didn't get answered in the upcoming post-webinar email that we'll send you. There will be a number of links that include the archived webinar and all the resources, bios of our speakers, how to reach them if you have other questions or want to learn more about some of the work that they are engaged in. And this will continue to be an ongoing conversation. We have GLR Week coming up this July in Washington, D.C., and I can almost bet you it will be a topic of discussion. So definitely more to come. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Pat, Sarah, Linda, Ellen, for another great webinar, and we hope that all of you listening today will join us in the upcoming webinars that you see on your screen. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.